Hey guys, it's time to do the seventh and the final objection that is anticipated by Smart. So we're going to explore that and we're going to find out what reply he has to offer. Let's have a look. What are we going to achieve today? What's our overall goal? Well, we're going to explore Smart's reply to his seventh anticipation or anticipated objection to his identity thesis in the strict sense. Remember the strict sense and what the criteria is for the identity thesis in the strict sense. That means, again, we've got a name, define, and interrelate key terms. A lot of the terms that we're going to look at today are terms that have already been covered in the previous replies. There's a lot of theory today, but at the same time, it shouldn't really be anything new, okay? We're going to have a look at our summary. The summary then provides us with the basics to understand the nuanced arguments being developed in the actual writing. So if it doesn't make sense during the summary, hold on and we'll see if it makes better sense when we actually read the text. All right, so quickly write these down for me, please, and then score yourself out of 4 for each of them. And once you've done that, I want you to look at this image here, and I want you to go back to when we defined contingency versus necessity. The other synonymous terms, like for contingent, we can say it's an empirical relationship. We can say it's a posteriori relationship. We can say it's synthetic, all right? But go back and have a look at Hume's fork. We covered that while we're doing objection 2. And have a look at this picture here. And there is a contingent relationship being suggested here. It's pretty obvious once you think about it and write that down. Okay, so remember that when we talk about contingency, we're talking about some kind of truth based in space and time where obviously there's some kind of synthetic knowledge that's being generated or some knowledge generated after observation a posteriori, or more importantly, a situation where the predicate doesn't really imply the subject. So two pieces of information and observations have been married together to create a overall new piece of information, but this is information observed a posteriori or information observed empirically using the scientific or other kind of empirical methods, okay? That's really important. You've got to recap on what contingency means, because without that we can't really understand an objection to what I think is a pretty facile argument, probably because I've been brainwashed to think that science works. So to me, this kind of objection to his thesis, I mean, it may have been something that really stood out when we were, I don't know, 300 BC, and you could imagine Socrates going through the Socratic method and, teasing out the deeper assumptions made in the original argument to prove it true. Like those kind of things I could imagine happening. But on the surface, to me, this objection 7 seems to be the most facile argument. Yet, oddly enough, it tends to be the one that produces the deepest conclusions. So let's have a look. All right. So this argument's pretty simple. It says, I can conceive of being a person that is turned to stone, yet I could imagine as a stone person, I could still have sensations. I can imagine that should happen. And the argument goes, it's not directly stated, but the argument is implied, because I can imagine or I can conceive of a situation where I've been turned into stone, but I can still experience sensations. The sensations must be difficult from physical processes. Okay, that's the argument. Seems pretty hard to swallow, probably because we were brought up in the age of science and we tend to automatically make that direct correlation between brain processes and after images or the sensations that we experience. Okay, so keep that in mind. But the argument is as follows. Again, I'll repeat it. You should write it down. I can conceive of being turned into stone, yet still experiencing sensations. Okay, take a note. All right, now to this Smart said, look, you can imagine anything, right? But just because you can conceive of something and imagine it, that doesn't really shed light on what is true in terms of an ontological sense, right? So let's remember that, as I tried to allude to when we're doing objection 2, that the sensation side of things, or the language we use to describe sensation, or the way we refer to sensation, is merely referring to the same ontological object as the language that we use or the logic that we use to explain brain processes. And similarly, that was developed through argument 6 and argument 5, which were basically saying, look, yeah, again, the same can be said of experience, right? Experience is the brain process enacting or going through the neurological processes that creates or generates the experience. But of course, it's the experience of the after image, or what the after image is something different. And if you remember too, he did say that sense datum doesn't really exist in an ontological sense. We may see it, but it doesn't have the realness in this material world. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, just remember to ask me a question later on, okay? So, remember when he said that the language that we use to talk about experience and the language we use to talk about brain processes is different and has different meanings and it has lots of different logic, okay? But that doesn't mean that they're not the same. Remember, when we have an exclamation mark and an equals, that's usually what we call code for not. So that doesn't mean that we're not referring to the same thing in that language. The meanings are different, but the meanings are pointing to the same ontological object. That should be really clear because we've covered that. So an analogy would be, and this is really bizarre, but it kind of makes sense at the end of what he's explaining. Imagine if we said something similar or something that a parallel argument or an argument that kind of expresses the absurdity of that kind of logic is we say something true like what can be composed of nothing cannot be composed of anything. And what he goes on to do is to use this kind of logic to explore a possible monism that must exist if we were to accept that sensations are merely contingent objects that depend on, possibly through cause and effect or other relationships, the brain producing them, rather than them being ontologically the same thing, but we have meaning that ascribes to them some kind of difference, right? So what he says is if we accept that the the only things that really exist are the sensations or the after image when I close my eye, right? And we can say, you know, these things are immediately apparent to us. We see them as they are, and they just appear, okay, in any way, shape, or form, or any way our senses detect them. But if we say there's a contingency between brain process and um, and the sensation we experience, you know, we could arrive at a point where we conclude that maybe the brain processes aren't real because basically, you know, the only thing that we have immediate apparent knowledge of is our sensations. Now, yes, these sensations could be false representations of something external. That's fine, but the fact is they appear to us in their totality and their completeness and their perfectness as they are things in and of themselves, right? So the after image is just the thing that I see, that I imagine that I see, all right? So it could be that this doesn't exist. And he says, if I have this hypothesis that the two are contingent, and I could imagine a situation where the material brain processes don't exist, what I'm really proposing, or what I'm really suggesting, is that the world exists according to a type of monoism. And if I believe that the material brain processes don't really exist because they're contingent, they're separate, and, you know, sensation is immediately apparent to it, but we have to interpret how brain processes produce a sensation. Right. What I'm really doing is I'm saying, well, if it's not the brain processes that actually are real, if they don't really do what we think they do, or if they're not real in and of themselves, then after images have to exist as this kind of immaterial ghost stuff. They exist as a substance, but that substance isn't material, kind of like Descartes' thinking thing. Remember Descartes said the thinking thing is immaterial? It's still not a substance, but that substance was a spiritual substance. Well, it's kind of like what Smart is saying here. Smart is saying, look, if you accept that that the two are contingent, you could easily conclude that perhaps it's not necessarily so, but perhaps there is no such thing as the brain process, and you arrive at this monoism of the ideal, all right, which is basically the monoism of what the after image is it exists as a ghost stuff. And he says, look, the fact is, the reason why we could say it's a ghost stuff is that experiences have to be made of something. We experience them. They are real to us. We have them, you know. So they have to be made out of something. And when he actually analyzes it, he can say, look, experiences could be made out of this immaterial ghost stuff, which is really a form of idealism, all right? That's a form of where, things exist as ideas or separate from the material reality. Or they could exist in the physical world. And he comes down on the idea that they exist in the physical world. He believes that they are a product of material processes and basically says, yep, tick, this is what they are. If I had to come down on the side of monoism, I would come down on the side of materialism, you know? So that also explains why before he says sense datum, like images, they're not real in an ontological sense, right? They are merely manifestations of the real thing that occurs, which is the brain processes. Now, he concedes readily there is no a priori knowledge for this, but perhaps in the future we'll have the best a priori knowledge that we can to actually definitively prove that the world of materiality, or the materialist world, or the material world, is where, sensation really occurs and brain processes are. Okay? Take a note. All right, objection 7. I can imagine myself turned into stone and yet having images, aches, pains, and so on. Yep, anyone can imagine it. I could imagine I'm an elephant. That's why to me the argument seems facile. Like, just imagining something doesn't make it real. I think he alludes to that in his reply. I can imagine that the electrical theory of lightning is false. That lightning is some sort of purely optical phenomenon. And when he says phenomenon, a phenomenon is an objective experience. Remember that. That's why I said before, phenomenal knowledge, phenomenal language is language of experience. Okay? It can be language that is definitely separate from the material world. All right, not all the time though. I can imagine that lightning is not an electrical discharge. I can imagine that the evening star is not the morning star, but it is. So here he's saying, look, actually, just because you can imagine different relationships and different concepts and they have different meanings, that doesn't remove their ontological reality. Okay? Take a note. All the objection shows is that experience and brain processes do not have the same meaning, which is what he said before. It does not show that experience is not in fact a brain process. So what he's saying is, just because I have different meanings doesn't mean we're not pointing to the same thing that occurs. Experience is a brain process. We just have different language to describe experience as we do brain process. Okay? This objection is perhaps much the same as one which can be summed up in the slogan, what can be composed of nothing cannot be composed of anything. Let's read further and see how he elaborates on this, guys. The argument goes as follows. On brain processes, look, it's really clear now. Now that I've read the context, I can further explain what he means by this statement. So imagine if we have this kind of, the reason why he posits kind of like a monoism is because imagine if the sensations and experiences occur in a separate world. Obviously they're composed of nothing, but what is this nothing? It has to be a something substance, yeah? So if you get this quote on an exam, and I wouldn't be surprised if you did, to tell you the truth, and just the quote, you'd be really confused. Why does SMART refer to the above analogy? What can be composed of nothing cannot be composed of anything. Well, obviously you'd say, look, you could argue that the after image is kind of composed of nothing because it has no materiality. But that means that it has to be made out of some kind of stuff because it's real, it appears to us. So that stuff could literally be anything. And then he further goes on to elaborate what he means in concrete. Okay? Take a note. The argument goes as follows. On the brain processes thesis, the identity between the brain process and the experience is a contingent one. So it is logically possible that there should be no brain process and not process of any other sort either. No heart process, no kidney process, or no other processes. There would be the experience, but no corresponding physiological process, which we might be able to identify through it empirically. Okay, so what he's saying is, so it logically follows that there should be no brain process. All right, let's go further. The argument goes as follows. On the brain process thesis, the identity between the brain process and the experience is a contingent one. So what he's saying is it's a relationship of dependence. All right, it's a relationship where the two don't exactly imply the existence of the other. They're completely separate. All right, so therefore it logically follows that there should be no brain process or any other physical process that underpins it, because we have the immediate experience. They just kind of occur together, almost like a harmony, almost like Leibniz's harmony. Okay. So, when we talk about the physiological process which we might be able to identify empirically, well, there would be no experience, but there would be the experience, but no corresponding physiological process, because the two are contingent upon each other. They occur by chance. They're observed. We don't know if they directly cause each other. We don't have definitive a priori truth about whether or not one causes the other. All right. I suspect that the objector is thinking of the experience as a ghostly entity, so it is composed of something, not nothing. There you go. That's why we're referring to composed of anything here in this statement. Thought it was composed of nothing anymore, but then we realize that it has to be composed of nothing. So it is composed of nothing, not of something, not of nothing. After all, on his view, it is composed of a ghost stuff, and a mind is composed of a brain stuff. So that's where he means he's referring to the physical. Yeah. Perhaps the counter reply will be that the experience is simply simple and uncompounded, and so it is not composed of anything after all. This seems to be a quibble, for if it were taken seriously, the remark, what can be composed of nothing can be composed of anything, could be recast as an a priori argument against Democritus and atomism, and for Descartes and infinite divisibility, All right, so here he's referring to lots of other philosophers. He's saying, look, it's just a small little side argument. What's the point? What can be composed of nothing cannot be composed of anything. It could be recast as an a priori argument against, which helps us fight against Democritus and his atomism, and it could be an argument for Descartes and his infinite divisibility, which is basically his idea of substance. Okay, side argument, we don't need to know it. And it seems odd that a question of this sort should be settled a priori. We must therefore construe the word composed in a very weak sense, which would allow us to say that even an indivisible atom is composed of something, namely itself. The dualist cannot really say that an experience can be composed of nothing. That makes sense, doesn't it, guys? You can't really say it's composed of nothing. Which is almost like him saying it's composed of something immaterial. I think the two are meant to be synonymous. For he holds that experiences are something over and above the material process, that is, that they are sort of a ghost stuff. And that's true. The dualist can't say that it's composed of nothing, because the experiences must be composed of something which is not material, but it's over and above it. So it must be composed of something. Take a note. And then he's being a bit of a smartass. He says, or perhaps ripples in an underlying ghost stuff. I say that the dualist hypothesis is a perfectly intelligible one. He's saying, yep, I think that might actually be a reasonable thing to say. It can be composed of stuff outside of and it's over and above the material processes. But I say that experiences are not to be identified with ghost stuff, but with the brain stuff. This is another hypothesis, and in my view, very plausible. But the present argument cannot knock it down using a priori. All right, so that's a lot. That's actually quite deep. We're really going into metaphysics there, metaphysics and ontology. So you pretty much understand that when he's talking about the linguistic turn, or the way language works, he's really saying that meaning can mean two different things, but be based on the same ontological thing. So ergo, the language that we use to refer to experience has very different logic to language used to refer to brain processes, but they are the one true ontological thing. Now, if you didn't have that concept that they were the one true ontological thing, you just notice that they always occurred in a contingent relationship, either through cause and effect or just through association. When one happens, the other always happens. It might not be cause and effect, whatever. If you imply that, then you could imagine foreseeably that the only thing that's really apparent to you is your sensations. Okay, that makes sense. So therefore it logically follows that anything that occurs with it might not exist at all, because you've got nothing but sensation. And then he says, well, quite clearly, if you follow this argument logically through, you know, it's not material, so therefore it's supposed to be made out of a nothing. But then again, if you're implying that it actually exists and you can see it and detect it and interact with it, then it must be made out of something, but that something is over and above the material world, which I believe the brain processes occur in. And he says, look, this is a perfectly reasonable and intelligible argument, but I still think that it's perfectly reasonable to say that things happen according to brain processes. And that's probably backed up from his assumption that ontologically they're the same, but the two spheres of language mean different things. Now, if you kind of get all that, you've got to really write that down. You've got to nut that down, right? Because this is probably the deepest reply that we've got. And it's just really important that you know it at a deep, deep level, okay? He literally says, I say that the dualist hypothesis is a perfectly intelligent one, but I say that experiences are not to be identified with ghost stuff, but with the brain stuff, right? And he literally thinks that experience is the brain process performing the neurological functions that it does, generating the actual experience that we have. And, the sense datum or the after image is a product of that, right? And he doesn't say that the experience and that sense datum, actually, no, he does say experience means brain process, because brain process creates experience. But the after image or the sense datum that you do experience doesn't mean brain process. They are different things. So meaning is different, ontology is the same. That's what you've got to understand about this guy, okay? That's a lot to take in. So let's go here. We explored by naming, defining, and interrelating different terms. We definitely read about his conclusions based on what would happen if things were contingent, and sensation is, the only one true thing we assumed. You probably know why, okay, after that summary, why we thought this image was important. It just got you to say, hey, cause and effect is a contingent relationship. But so is association. There are so many other things that are contingent relationships, okay? And of course, we need to trace how he develops his reply. To me, it came together a lot more succinctly when I actually did the reading. But I don't think I could have understood the reading without the summary. I think I could have. All right, so that's it, guys. Now, it's really important that you talk to me about this one, because even a solid knowledge of objection 7 shows a solid knowledge of all the other objections, okay?